Every watch brand wants you to believe it makes something special. The ads are polished, the ambassadors are famous, and the boutiques are lit to make you feel underdressed. None of that answers the question I care about, which is whether the watch on your wrist today will still be running in 20 years. That's the whole basis for this ranking. Worst to best, judge the way an engineer would judge it, which means some famous names are going to come out badly. So before we get near anyone's favorite brand, it's worth being clear about where reliability actually lives inside a watch, because it isn't the dial and it isn't the bracelet. It's behind the case back, in a space smaller than a postage stamp, where a couple of hundred moving parts have to cooperate well enough to measure time. Most of it comes down to the escapement. It sits between the mainspring, which is the coiled energy source, and the balance wheel, and its job is to release that energy in tiny controlled pulses. Better engineering there means more precise release and slower wear. The materials, the tolerances, and the geometry all feed into how long the watch stays accurate between services. Parts that resist magnetism, corrosion, and temperature swings outlast parts that don't, which is obvious enough once you say it out loud. Finishing matters for a less obvious reason. Properly polished and deburred components generate less friction. Less friction means less heat, and less heat means less wear. A movement finished to a high standard will hold spec longer than one that wasn't, whatever the brochure says. Then there's the half of reliability nobody puts in an ad, which is whether the thing can be fixed. It's a machine. It will need service. Some brands design movements a watchmaker can open and repair with normal tools, instead of proprietary equipment that only exists inside the brand's own service centers. And over 30 years, that difference is enormous. Same goes for whether parts still exist by then. A lot of brands simply never think that far ahead, and you won't find out which ones until you need them to have. Start at the bottom, where this gets uncomfortable. Some watch brands exist to sell an image. They buy movements from outside suppliers, drop them into cases drawn by stylists rather than engineers, and charge for the name printed on the dial. Fossil, Michael Kors, Armani Exchange. Assembly operations, not watchmakers. The movements inside are usually fine, often well proven, but the brand contributed close to zero engineering. So what you're paying for is design and a logo. I don't think that's illegitimate, incidentally. Plenty of people want a watch that looks expensive without spending much, and that's a real need. It just isn't a 20-year watch. Parts get hard to find, and service tends not to exist at all once the warranty runs out. Smartwatches fail differently. By pure function, the Apple Watch is one of the most accurate timekeepers ever sold, synced to atomic clocks, and correct to a fraction of a second. It just isn't built to last. It's built to be replaced, which is a design choice, not a defect. Software support ends, batteries fade, and an Apple Watch bought in 2026 is probably a drawer ornament by 2035, while a mechanical watch that gets serviced can run for a century. Neither is the wrong answer. They're answering different questions, and it's worth knowing which question you're buying into. Further up the price ladder, Hublot has taken real criticism, some of it fair. The designs are striking and nobody disputes that. But for the money, the movement engineering hasn't always matched what buyers at that level would expect to be getting. They've moved toward more in-house development recently, and the trajectory is right. Today, though, a lot of what you're paying for is still the way it looks. Tag Heuer is where serious watchmaking starts. They've been in racing and precision timing for more than a century, and the Carrera, named after the Carrera Panamericana road race, has decades of production behind it as a chronograph that holds up. Their COSC certified movements are tested to run within -4 to +6 seconds a day. For something driven by a coiled spring, that's real precision. Tag isn't the most inventive engineering house in Switzerland, and I doubt anyone there would claim otherwise. But they're consistent, and consistency is most of what you're buying. Breitling pushes it further. Almost the entire lineup carries COSC certification, which sounds like a small thing, until you notice how many brands certify only their Halo models. Running it across the Navitimer, the Super Ocean, and everything else costs money, and points to a culture that takes the number seriously. Pilots and divers use these for work. That kind of validation isn't purchasable with an ad budget. IWC Schaffhausen is different in one specific way, which is how plain the engineering is. The big pilot's watch descends from Second World War cockpit instruments, and it's built for legibility and for surviving things. No excess, no decoration. The movement lives in a case designed to absorb abuse and keep running, and the company's long history of supplying military and aviation customers says more than any press release could. Tudor deserves specific credit here. It's Rolex's sister brand, and that relationship is not decorative. The movements share engineering with Rolex, and are built to standards that tower over most watches at similar money. Black Bay and Pelagos get bought by serious collectors and then kept, which tells you something. The Pelagos in particular is a professional diver certified to 500 meters, and I don't know of much else at that price doing that job as well. Longines, Tissot, and Hamilton round out this group. Longines has held more precision records than almost any brand in history, and has been at it since 1832. Tissot's PRX runs thoroughly proven movements at prices normal people can pay, and Hamilton's khaki field, originally supplied to the US military, is the watch any competent watchmaker can service half asleep. Parts are everywhere. The movement is simple enough that there isn't much in it to fail, if reliability per dollar is the thing you're optimizing for. I'd argue the khaki field automatic is the most sensible watch purchase on the market, and it isn't close. Here's where buyers tend to get surprised. Seiko, Citizen, and Casio belong in the same conversation as Swiss brands, costing several times more. Seiko is one of the only fully vertically integrated watch manufacturers on Earth, making its own movements, hairsprings, crystals, and cases. That's rare to the point of being odd. Most brands assemble parts sourced from a web of suppliers and inherit whatever quality those suppliers had that month. Seiko owns the entire chain, so quality is controlled at every step of it. The NH35, the movement inside the widely loved Seiko 5, is one of the most proven automatic calibers ever built. Simple, tough, produced in the millions, which means every watchmaker on Earth already knows it, and parts will be around indefinitely. The Prospex divers are ISO, certified to real working standards, and Navy divers have trusted them with their lives. The honest caveat at the cheap end is consistency. Some buyers open the box to slightly misaligned indices or chapter rings. It mostly disappears as you move up the range, but it's a real thing and you should know before you order, rather than after. Citizen's EcoDrive is, to me, one of the neatest answers anyone has found to the power problem. A solar cell sits behind the dial and converts light, including the weak overhead light of an office, into charge held in a rechargeable cell. Fully charged, it runs for months in complete darkness, and essentially never needs servicing. If what you want is a watch that just works and never asks anything of you, there isn't much competition. Then Casio. The G-Shock came out of one engineer's fixation on building a watch that could survive a 10-meter drop onto concrete, and Kikuo Ibe spent 3 years failing at it before he got there. The answer was to float the movement module inside shock-absorbing resin within a protective outer case. It's been copied constantly and never quite matched. 4 decades on, military units in more than a dozen countries issue G-Shocks as standard equipment, which is about as hard an endorsement as reliability ever gets. 2 brands sit at the top of mainstream luxury, and both got there through engineering rather than mythology. Omega's last 30 years come down largely to one invention by one man, the coaxial escapement, created by the British master watchmaker George Daniels. A conventional escapement works through sliding friction, which wears components and ages the oils that keep them alive. The coaxial geometry cuts that sliding contact dramatically, so the movement holds accuracy longer between services and wears more slowly exactly where it matters most. Omega then did the harder part, which was industrializing it across the entire collection, and paired it with master chronometer certification, 8 separate tests run by Metis, Switzerland's official metrology authority, covering accuracy, magnetic resistance up to 15,000 Gauss, water resistance, and power reserve. By 2025, more than 2.5 million Omega watches had passed. You can go and read the standard yourself, which is more than you can say for most claims in this industry. Rolex works the way good manufacturing operations everywhere work. Incremental improvement, exhaustive validation, no unnecessary risk. The Caliber 3 235 is decades of accumulated learning made physical. Nearly 90% of its components were redesigned from the 3135 it replaced, but the brief never changed, which was more accurate, more robust, easier to service. The Chronergy escapement is nickel phosphorus, a paramagnetic alloy that improves energy efficiency by about 15% over conventional materials. The Parachrome hairspring shrugs off magnetic fields and temperature variation, and the recommended service interval of 7 to 10 years tells you what timescale the thing was designed around. Rolex reported 11 billion Swiss francs in revenue in 2025, more than triple any competitor, which is the kind of number that invites cynicism until you look at what's underneath it. Buyers have been stress testing that engineering case for a century, and it keeps holding. Above Omega and Rolex, there are 3 companies that are as much watchmaking history as watchmaking: Patek Philippe, Audemars Piguet, and Vacheron Constantin, the Holy Trinity. Patek, founded in Geneva in 1839, is by most reasonable measures the most technically accomplished watch manufacturer there has ever been. They've produced movements carrying more than 30 individual individual complications. Their caliber, 240, an automatic just 2.53 millimeters thick, took years to engineer and still hasn't been matched at that level of refinement. Patek also keeps spare parts for watches made more than 30 years ago, and it's still family-owned, which means engineering decisions run on a generational clock instead of a quarterly one. There's that old line about never owning a Patek, only looking after it for the next generation. It reads like advertising copy because it is advertising copy, but it also happens to describe how the watches are actually built. Audemars Piguet was founded in 1875 in Le Brassus, a village in the Vallée de Joux that has been producing exceptional watchmakers since the 17th century. Their ultra-thin perpetual calendars, minute repeaters, and flying tourbillons aren't complications bolted on to justify the invoice. They're what several generations of accumulated skill ends up producing. Vacheron Constantin has been in continuous, uninterrupted production since 1755, longer than anyone else still operating, and carries 2.5 centuries of knowledge into every watch that leaves Geneva. That's not a heritage story for the catalog. 270 years of institutional knowledge, built one caliber at a time, is a working advantage. And at the very top, placed there by engineering rather than prestige or price or lineage, is Grand Seiko with the spring drive movement. Picture a watch powered entirely by a mechanical mainspring wound, by the motion of your wrist. No battery, nothing to plug in, no external energy source at all. But instead of a conventional escapement, it uses a built-in electronic regulator driven by a tiny electromagnetic brake called the glide wheel, and it holds plus or minus 1 second a day. That's twice as precise as Rolex's superlative chronometer standard and tighter than Omega's master chronometer, with no battery anywhere in the watch. As a piece of pure engineering, I'd put it among the great achievements in the history of timekeeping. The idea came from Seiko engineer Yoshikazu Akahane in 1977. It took 27 years to reach the market, which required the kind of patience and funding that really only a vertically integrated company can sustain, and Spring Drive finally launched in 2004. The snowflake dial, textured by hand to evoke the frost on the fields around the Shizukuishi studio in Iwate, looks like nothing any Swiss brand has ever made, and the movement behind it beats them on measurable accuracy. One practical note before you get excited. Grand Seiko's service network is thinner than Rolex's or Omega's, and depending where you live, that matters. On the engineering merits, though, nothing touches it. Watch is the only machine most people carry against their body every single day. It takes weather, sweat, magnetic fields, and the occasional collision with a doorframe, and it's expected to come through decades of that still accurate and still worth looking at. The brands that manage it aren't reliably the ones with the loudest marketing or the longest waiting lists. Sometimes it's a quiet Japanese factory refining a movement that's been in production for 40 years. Sometimes it's a family workshop in Geneva where one gear takes 3 months to finish. And sometimes it's an $80 Hamilton movement sitting in a case that hasn't changed since the 50s. So the question to ask of any watch is whether it'll still be running when you're not. Nobody can promise you an answer 20 years early, but the odds are readable, and now you know how to read them. Subscribe to the channel and give the video a like. There's plenty more coming. And if you liked this one, click the next video on screen for another breakdown.